Hello and welcome into the second episode of Anzu Talks. I'm your host, Mitch Reames. I'm a multimedia esports and gaming journalist with a focus on industry topics. This show is going to continue with our trend of extremely top-level guests, and we're excited to have Joost Van Dreunen, the former CEO and co-founder of SuperData Research. He sold that company to Nielsen in 2018, and now he's a startup advisor, investor, and professor at the NYU Stern School of Business. Joost, it's a pleasure to have you on Anzu Talks.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Welcome in, welcome in. And we are also joined, as always, by Itamar Benedy, the co-founder and CEO of Anzu. Itamar, welcome. Good to talk to you again.
Hey Mitch, hey Joost, great to see you both.
Bye-bye.
I'm really excited to do this. Our first show went great, and I'm sure this one will go amazing as well. The title of this show is Capitalizing on Gaming's Creative Potential, as you all saw. Now, that's a pretty large topic, and will be segmented into some smaller areas, including video games as a means of cultural expression, exploring the idea of the metaverse and what that means for the industry, plus seeing how changes in the gaming landscape from next generation consoles to evolving pricing models will impact gaming going forward. So we've got plenty of topics, but regardless of where we're at in the discussion, we're going to reserve the final portion of the show for audience questions. About 15 minutes or so of the 45 minutes overall we have for this webinar. So you can submit questions into the portal on the right, and once that time comes, I'll switch to that mode. So feel free to get your questions in at any point in the discussion whenever it's topical, and we'll be jumping around to answer as many as we can once we get to that portion. So with that being said, let's get into the discussion. Let's start by setting the stage for the current gaming landscape. I'm sure the different audience members have different levels of knowledge about gaming, probably from industry professionals to people who are more curious about this space. And so I want to start with the big story of the last year and a half, which is the pandemic, and then hopefully we could stop talking about that. During this period of time, video games went even more mainstream than they already were, as online portals became a meeting ground and a place for socialization in an often isolated time. Not to mention, revenues went absolutely through the roof in almost every different gaming sector. Still, the pandemic was more accelerating a trend than it was creating one. Joost, in your opinion, when did gaming officially go mainstream in the general public's eyes?
That's an excellent question. It's I think a very current one, right? So in my mind, the real thing about the games industry that so few people seem to realize, and once you are in it, right? Once you work on the supply side, it becomes over. But to play is sort of a natural instinct for people, right? You don't have to explain to a 2-year-old how to play with a ball or with blocks. You don't have to. It's something that mammals naturally do. Like you take a tiger cub and they play too. Like you learn through playing. And so if I wear my academic hat, I would say something like it's a natural universal instinct that is totally outside of history, in that everyone has always played and always will play. I think what's interesting in terms of the industry today is that it's figured out, that gaming wasn't just for this one fringe audience on the sidelines. Even though the economics for a long time sort of pushed it into, well, we're just going to be making shooter games for boys that live in their parents' basements, right? That became sort of the stereotype, and it hurt the industry, I think, for a long time. That sort of the transition to become a mainstream form of entertainment that started, I think, in the early 2000s, when you start to see, as crappy as they were, you saw, games on Facebook and these social network-based games where you have people harassing each other to come help out on my farm, that sort of interaction. But that was really very accessible, low entry points for most people out there. And from there, I think a real catalyst was, of course, the popularization of the smartphone. So I would say probably around 2004, 2005, we see early Facebook coming around, then the transition into mobile, and then finally, I guess, really with an exclamation mark, the pandemic sort of really drives home that now we watch games, we watch other people play games on the internet, we play together, we can't be together because of the pandemic, and so we go to Animal Crossing, New Horizons, and find some kind of togetherness there. And you see all these different behaviors emerge. There's a new console launch, and so you have this perfect storm of catalysts and drivers that really, in a sense, sort of doubled the interest in the industry. And but the pretext is 15 years in the making, so to say. So I would roughly put it around 2004, 2005.
Absolutely. That's earlier than I think some people would put it, but your point about the Facebook games and the games through social media was revolutionary because those were mainstream platforms by any estimation, and games were very core to them, especially in those early days. I think less so now than they were
Mm-hmm.
back then, but there were so many games that played through that. Itamar, I'm gonna ask the same question to you. Would you put it around the same time period, or is there some other moments, even more recently, that you think were pretty pivotal in this idea of going mainstream?
Yeah, I mean, first after Jost's answer, which was very, full and complete, I guess we can go to the next French question. No, I'm kidding. I mean, maybe a few points to add to that. I mean, I guess Jost has a better, understanding than me of the early days of gaming before I became obsessed with gaming and started Anzu. But maybe a few points I can add from my perspective. First, I mean, you can play or you can play. I mean, there's different types of play. And I think what's happened in the last years, even before COVID, like the quality of the games. So you see the rise of the new game engine with the Unreal Game Engine and the plans around Amazon Lumberyard, and then this next generation Xbox and PlayStation launches, and the plans around cloud gaming with different approaches how to do it. I think there's just like the level of the quality of the game is so much better that just gives you another reason to play, but to play and enjoy even more. So I think that's one point to mention. Number two, I think it's interesting to define 1 second, like who exactly are we speaking when we speak about gamers, right? Is a person playing chess.com, is he a gamer? Is a person playing Candy Crush or a hyper casual game, is he a gamer? I think the definition of gaming is so broad from, idle time on your mobile to more hardcore game that you need hours just to understand the game. And I remember a few years ago, first time I went to an esports tournament of one of the Valve games. It took me some time. I never saw the game before to even understand what's happening there. Right? I felt there's a random connection between the audience getting excited and what I saw happening on the screen. And I think that's part of the power of gaming. It's so diversified. If you want to play like an idle game that is easy to understand how to play, or more core game, or different types of games for different ages, games for different genres. So I think it's so broad and so diverse that each basically person can find the type of game that he would enjoy. And I agree, Mitch, that COVID didn't, make things different than what I was thought that would happen. Just accelerated a lot of these things to happen faster. So people who were not playing games because maybe they didn't have time to that, or they were allocating a lot of time to sports or out of home interactions, or having a negative perception about gaming, finally started to look into gaming. So there's these new gamers from COVID that a big portion of them will stay gamers. So I guess that's another reason. And also, gaming is becoming more accessible, right? So of course, as what mobile games brought to the world, with having free games and versus prepaid games, internet connection in emerging markets, 5G. So the combination of like more reasons to play games, more quality games, more accessible games, games for all genres, games for all ages, all of this together just like pushed the gaming industry, and we are now at a point that everyone is a gamer, everyone is excited about gaming, and all the tech giants are allocating significant budgets and resources around being involved in the gaming industry. So it could not be a more exciting time to be in the gaming industry than these days.
Absolutely. Yeah,
I
so much there.
want to. Can I reply just real quick? It's the I remember that esports moment too, so many moons ago. You're just standing there in front of the screen. You're like, what's happening, right? And I used to play plenty of Counter-Strike, in this illegal esports cafe in Chinatown, a long time ago. But to stand in front of a crowd, like the thing is always the same. It's like, what's happening on the screen, right? I was never really big on Dota, for instance, and so that's always like, it might as well just be a foreign language. But the experience is very much the same as a Dutchman living in New York watching American football. Like, what's happening? For God's sake, explain it to me. And then over time, you're like, oh, okay, so he's the quarterback, and so the rules become more clear over time. But then you start to understand like how significant it is, right? I'm watching the Euro Cup this week with the Dutch, of course, winning the other day. But it's the moment when you start to see through it, you realize like the depth of it, right? And I think the mindset for a lot of people when it comes to understanding that games are mainstream and so pervasive is that they're having that American football moment, that esports moment. Is like they're looking at it and they rationally know what they're looking at, but they don't emotionally understand yet the depth and the evocativeness of it. And that's a really interesting inflection point, I think, in the industry.
Absolutely agree. And esports are by nature often very complicated, but I love American football and European football as comparisons for this because both games have core moments that are really important that don't have any impact on the scoreboard. And people get very excited when, say, you get a first down or a beautiful play or a beautiful pass. It doesn't always amount to points, but people who understand the game know when to get excited. And for people who are watching for the first time, they're like, that was good, but I'm not exactly sure why that was good. And then when you get more experience, you really start to understand that. And esports is on its way to reaching that point where people start to get more of the nuances of the games and more of the excitement. So I'm curious because Itamar, a bit on your discussion, you talked about accessibility and how games are becoming more available. And there's uh, more platforms for them to play on, and there's also changing price models on that front. We've seen, well, some esports in particular have been pioneers on this front, like League of Legends, offering their game to be free to play and monetizing through in-game cosmetics, and then other games like Call of Duty charging $60 every year to do that, and then running the Call of Duty League. But in general, we're seeing more and more esports go to this free to play, and we're going to monetize on cosmetics. How is that change in pricing models shaping the industry, and what has changed recently on that front that's going to have ramifications going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very exciting time around disruption and business models in the gaming industry. You know, historically the two main business models for AAA games was prepaid games, $60 discs, or now with and it's moving to from physical to digital versions, and not $60, it's now $70 because it's even more expensive to create the next generation. So that was historically the main business model for console developers, and second was in-app purchases. These two models are being challenged now these days. So games are moving to free to play because they see the value of it. Call of Duty launched the mobile version free to play, and they were surprised, I would assume, with the numbers that they can generate from that. So as games are moving to free to play, and as people less want to pay upfront for games, and as Twitch and esports and streaming is an important part of the growth of the game, it's tricky to do it on a paid game. So that's changing. And I believe in 2-3 years, 95% of the AAA and console games will be free to play. On the other side, in-app purchases are also being challenged, with lot boxes, and I believe what happened in the gambling industry is now in the early stage of happening in this area, where there will be regulations, and this is going to be significantly challenged and changed over the next year. We see the first cases of lawsuits around EA games, and mandatory to give the amount of time played and the amount of money spent. If these two business models are going to be challenged, something should change in the gaming industry. And I believe it's about the diversity around different business models. And here I'm quoting the legendary Phil Spencer, the Xbox bot, where he speaks very, direct about the need in different business models in the gaming industry. And like the Anzu thesis is exactly coming from that area, that we believe that brands and advertising is going to be a big portion of the gaming industry. There's a lot of indications for that. Marketers are getting more excited about gaming as an advertising category. A lot of the AAA developers are hiring advertising experts. The president of Activision, the president of Epic are all advertising and digital marketing experts. So they understand that, and we believe that by bringing to marketers easy access to gaming platforms, cross-platform platforms on the one side, and then tools to get confidence about media value with programmatic advertising and advertising standards and vendors, we believe there's a big opportunity, and we predict ads and games can be 10% of the whole gaming total ad revenue cake. So that's like how very high level, because I can speak for hours about this stuff. This is high level how I see some disruptions and changes in the business model video games.
Absolutely. And Joost, I think there's a natural follow-up there. Itamar mentions how brands are in these spaces, and then also how are they measuring the success of those activations? From your perspective, with your background in data, uh, how are these different models and brands entering games? How is that changing the data front? Are there some new challenges that come up with those changing models as well?
Oh, absolutely. So the time I spent first at SuperData and then the natural transition to Nielsen, as non-endemic companies started to be interested in gaming, the problem really falls into two buckets. Yes, there is the data issue of how do we measure the thing and how do we build a coalition of industry participants sharing data with each other, right? If you look at a Twitch and a YouTube, okay, guys, what's going on? Can we see each other's data? Can we agree on a single metric like average minute audience, right? This sort of this key piece that not only creates consistency between gaming companies and gaming platforms, but it also connects to the more conventional advertisers and brands. So that is the language that they have historically used to measure and weigh success. And so while gaming, of course, is a big deal, it's a $700 billion business worldwide, right? Advertising. So and indirect revenue across entertainment categories. So as a result, you kind of have to meet them in the middle, right? So gaming cannot define its own universe in terms of metrics and data sets. It has to be consistent with, in order to, media planners to go, okay, I'm going to spend some money here, 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 and in gaming, and then I can see the results at the end of the day. So the data problem, in my mind, is just more temporary and just a matter of getting people on board. Like once the Twitches and the brands and the publicists type companies, the WPPs of the world, start to all have a broader conversation, which of course is part of what's happening now because of the pandemic and because of the initiatives like an Anzu for that matter. That's broadening. I think we'll relatively easily arrive at a place where it's like, okay, we're all looking in the same direction. We're all approaching this problem from the same angle. What tends to be the challenge, and that's really the second bucket in my experience, is that so much of the industry when it comes to indirect advertising, indirect revenue and working with advertisers is that in their mind, gaming is still in the 1980s and the 1990s, right? It's like, oh, it's shooter games and it's all violence and it's all crazy people. It's like, yeah, think again, like take another look. And so we spend a lot of time educating, the soda brands of the world and the credit card companies of the world saying, what you are missing out on is a young audience that's tech savvy, it's early adopters that are totally comfortable in the digital online environment. That's your future consumer base. You can, pay through the nose a few years from now when everybody else is established and try to catch up on the newly emerging brands and services that cater to that audience. Or you can try some of that now and more organically build your relationship with them. And that was a really big sticking point because somewhere along the line, you deal with these large institutional firms that have billions of dollars. Esports was always a good example where you talk to advertisers, they will put 80, 90% of their budget in the Olympics, and they do that years in advance, right? And so that means that they only have a few percentage points of their budgets left to kind of see if they can get a bigger bang for their buck. And so that's when they try esports. But nobody until, I think that's we're still a few years out, but nobody's going to say, but we should take half of the Olympic budget and put it in esports. We're still a ways out from it. And it has nothing to do with measurement or with data or with technology. It has everything to do with sort of the risk profile of somebody's career going, I'm in my 60s, I'm 5 years away from retirement. I'm not trying to break anything on the way out. I'm just going to coast until. So it's going to take a generation of decision makers and managers for that really to take hold. But you start to see now that people are cross-pollinating, right? People that used to work in game companies, used to work on the live streaming component, they're starting to find their way in these industries and these brands and start to really become advocates of it. And I think that raises the conversation, but that's just a matter of changing the mental models that decision makers hold. So we're still a ways out for that.
Maybe two quick points I add here. So first, I mean, it's like I think those digital natives is one of the key main items in this shift, right? Because as digital natives take main roles at big brands and big advertising companies, their perception around gaming will be very different. and this will accelerate from generation to generation. So let's take a Twitch teenager when he's in his 50s and he's now an executive at a big brand. His perception will be significantly different than those older fashioned cable linear TV dudes still holding a lot of the budget, right? So I think that's going to be another shift in the perception and how gaming is being treated in the advertising world. So that's number one. And number two, when you took a brand like McDonald's, part of the power of this brand is that you see it everywhere. In Zimbabwe, you see this McDonald's sign, and this is part of the culture, right? Everyone recognizes the brand. Now there's generations spending less and less time in watching cable and linear TV, time in Netflix where there is no advertising model, and there's a big risks for those brands to have a weaker recognition with those audiences, those hard to reach audiences who play a lot of video games, who watch less TV, and there's less and less opportunities how to meet them. As Joe said, they're tech savvies, they maybe have ad blockers, they're very sensitive to user experience. I think that's a really interesting opportunity that we're looking at, and here at Anzu, part of the work we're doing is showing this incremental reach of new audiences accessible on the Trade Desk or on Google, who were not accessible before with realistic pricing or with enough attention. So I think that's like one area that is in specific interesting to look at.
I absolutely agree as well. And you bring up this great point of McDonald's and these brands that are synonymous the world over with simple logo, the golden arches, Nike swoosh, MasterCard, a red and a yellow circle side by side, and people just recognize that. And as we enter this age of metaverses and these online worlds, these online universes, it's becoming increasingly important for brands that want to maintain that ubiquity and that clean knowledge to also exist in these virtual worlds and try and have at least a similar presence in these worlds that they do in the virtual world that they do in the real world. So as we discuss the metaverse, I think we still need to define what this is, and it's become a buzzword recently, but there's a good reason for that. And it's kind of hard to perfectly summarize, but the most general explanation of the metaverse is that it's a shared virtual space. Oftentimes, it's attached to concepts of virtual reality in science fiction, like Ready Player One is one notable example. But VR is not a requirement. And recently, open world games with complex ecosystems are already becoming metaverses. Roblox and Minecraft are two really good examples of this. And for any parents on here, odds are pretty good your kids are either playing one of these games, used to play one, or will play them in the future. So, Joost, in your opinion, why has the metaverse become an important concept to be familiar with, especially recently, especially in this pandemic age where we're very isolated and kids especially aren't in schools, so they're finding more social avenues in these metaverse games like Minecraft and Roblox?
That's an excellent question. So I will always just so play the role of a skeptic and say, well, okay, here's a buzzword. I will initially just, whether I believe it or not, I will always sort of argue against it. But the thing that stands out to me as somewhat of a skeptic around the metaverse is that this has been a conversation that's recurrent. So in other words, the metaverse has popped up several times before. If you look in the history of just technology in general, rather from the origin of the internet all the way to gaming. What's uniquely different now, and I think that's one of the key drivers, is that the technology has reached a stage where it starts to effectively facilitate what has been missing all this time. And I really specifically mean, of course, things like broadband, right? I remember the time of AOL dial-up, and it was just like, it's just terrible experience, but it worked, and you could send email, but it wasn't, you couldn't do much more with it. Broadband has penetrated a great deal, but that's really the front end. Like, what's exciting about the metaverse is on the back end, you now start to see where these instances where people can occupy a shared space, not with the tens or with hundreds of them, but with thousands of them at the same time, right? And I think that's one of the companies I work with Genvid, they released a title called Peak Rivals, or Rival Peak, sorry. And that's its vision there is to have millions of people simultaneously provide input on this sort of organic online space where you all impact it at the same time. But it's not shards like what you see in World of Warcraft, right? That's more in 2005, where you would join a server and it would have like 2,000 people on there at the max, at the most. And then, if you want to jump over to another server with your friends, you would pay a transfer fee effectively. I think the metaverse carries this promise of us occupying the same persistent universe all at the same time, with just millions of people. And the technology is caught up to do that. And I think that that's a very organic way for people to spend time online, in the same way that we go to concerts together and to sports events. So I think one of the drivers is that. And then secondly, it's I watched my 8-year-old, right? And so he grows up in this world where these technologies are like air and water to him. If I compare, my mother would always talk about how when she was in her working years back in her 20s, to advance her career, she would get a typing diploma so that she become a typist for an office, and then she would type 60 words a minute. But it's like a driver's license to operate a typing machine, which is insane to think about, having to get a certification like that. So if I carry those two examples in my hand, on the one hand I have my mother with her typing diploma, and then here's my kid, and he's setting up his own LAN servers in Minecraft, and he's just totally, it's second nature to him. He doesn't even think about what he's doing, So that transition in a single lifetime, to me, is what really helps you understand the metaverse. Like, this is so common and so natural to people in their day-to-day life that maybe we are probably, the people in this call, probably most of us are probably a little on the older side, where it's like the 5-year-olds of the world, they have this in their fingers like nothing else. And so that's why I think the metaverse, despite having been brought up and sort of been featured repeatedly over the last couple of decades, I think its moment has arrived because the technology is there, but it's accompanied by the mindset of the actual users that would apply themselves to this type of technology. So it creates for a really interesting new space because it's dramatically different than what we've seen before.
Yeah, that next generation lives online, and when you watch them do really just explore the internet, you realize how much adoption that was accelerated because the internet was there for their formative years in a way that it was for us, but it also wasn't. Not in its current form by any estimation. So also, quick reminder to our audience, we're at the question portion. We don't have any questions. We'd love if you guys wanted to drop some in for us in the question or in the chat. Feel free to throw them down there, and I'll jump over there and ask them. But I have plenty of questions about the metaverse for our two guests here. So if you have questions, please ask them. We'd love to see them. But I'll keep firing until you do. Itamar, over to you. How do you describe the metaverse, and why is it important to industry discussions and to brand discussions, especially these days?
Yeah, I mean, I see the metaverse as, people spending time in a virtual world. And I think one of the problems with the metaverse is the definition of there's the real world and then there's the metaverse. So if the metaverse is the opposite, so that's the not real world, right? So I think the definition should start from the physical world and the virtual world, but not real and not real worlds. And for me, it's quite simple. Do people have enough incentive to spend a bigger and bigger portion of their time in a virtual environment? And if the answer is yes, the metaverse would happen. If the answer is no, it won't happen. Joost spoke about technology. When VR technology wasn't good enough and you cannot be there for 5 hours in a row because you won't be comfortable with it, then the metaverse will not happen. And if Epic are bringing to Fortnite Quibi short videos and Travis Scott concerts, there is more and more reasons to treat Fortnite as a social network inside the metaverse and not as a game. If the chat on Fortnite is more popular than WhatsApp for young American teenagers, then the metaverse would happen. So for me, that's like the question, if it would happen or not. The Roblox amazing IPO is a vet of confidence around the metaverse, in my opinion. But for me, when you speak about the metaverse, everyone speaks about Minecraft and Roblox. I want to speak about Epic and Fortnite, because for me, I see them as the #1 player, best positions to capture the metaverse, and there's few reasons. first, they are allocating significant resources, and they have a very holistic plan around capturing the metaverse. And I think when you start to look at Fortnite as a games, and then more games that can be connected to that world, and then Unreal Engine and what that allows to do, and then an angle for game developers via Unreal Engine, but then an angle for creators via Fortnite Creative and building islands. And I think that's where I get excited about the metaverse, because there is today in the Epic Group so many reasons to spend more and more time in a virtual world, and this will just be more and more attractive as time flies. So I think that's like my definition around the metaverse, and if it will happen and when it will happen. And then when you think from a brand perspective, it's like, it's also quite simple to look at this. Number one, is there a significant audience there? And as there is more reasons to be in the metaverse, there will be a bigger audience. They'll spend more time there, so there's more brand opportunities. Combine that with those premium environments, 3D worlds, and then immersive advertising that can be part of the world exactly as our brands interactions are in the physical world. And it's like, you should be crazy not to have a strategy around advertising and marketing and communication in the metaverse. And so I think, it's now the stars are aligned on this happening. Of course, COVID had, speeded up a lot of these things, as birthday parties for young adults in the US were inside Roblox because the physical event were closed, and now they get a glimpse of that. But it's also important to say that there's also downsides of the metaverse, and I guess that's a total different discussion for sure when we speak about children and education and limitations. But it's definitely a very exciting area to look at.
Absolutely. It's one of those areas that, we could talk about for hours upon hours, and people like Joost who teach classes in this world, I'm sure will do that in the future as they talk about it. So we got some questions in. First question for Joost. You said that playing is, in our blood, and games are a natural form of, games are a natural form of playing, but why is it? This is actually broken. Sorry, it keeps scrolling the thing at all times and I can't see the other questions. Basically, I'll paraphrase it because I read it before this. Basically, games are a natural form of playing. Despite that, people don't really see the advantages in the video game world, and some consider video games, I believe they said, a childish thing. Why is that so, and how do we change that going forward?
That's a good one. So that's some deep-rooted mentality, right? So the separation between work and play is something that we've been dealing with for centuries, right? That's basically an ideological system that we inherited from continental religion, where it is a matter of frivolity and it's a waste of time to be playing because that's for kids. And fundamentally, if you look at the root, the Greek and Latin root for the word play, it's paideia, which refers to children. It's children's play. It's for children, right? And so the church kind of interpreted it as something like, okay, well, the grown-up adult world, the world of serious things and activities, it cannot be, occupied with frivolities like play. And so play occupies its space, in other words, separate from the rest of society. We see this when you go to an arena, right? When you go to a sports arena, you go through the catacombs into the big thing. If you've ever seen the Colosseum in Rome, it's no different than the Barclays Center 2 blocks from my house. You go through these hallways and then you get to the pitch, and that's where the lights are, and that's where the boxing ring is, the basketball court. And so that's the center of activity, but you transition into a different space. And that transition, and I'm wearing my academic hat, so you'll have to forgive me, but that indicates a separation of play and games from the rest of society. Now, if that's the case, right, then why is it that kids will play with anything? If you give a cat a box, it's totally happy to sit in that box and have a good time with it. And kids are the same way. But so somewhere along the line, people become trained or cultured into this idea that they're separate, when in fact, I don't think they are at all. I think play is one of the most intuitive ways for us to create meaning and to make sense of things. And so, in other words, that separation is sort of that's a taught belief system as opposed to what really comes natural to people. And by which I really mean when you first get your new iPad, which conceivably is a very dramatic, improvement of how you used to do things. When you get your first new smartphone or when you buy a new car, the first thing you do is like you resort to that inner child. They start pressing all the buttons and swiping things, right? And so for that reason, when the introduction of the smartphone by Apple, for instance, first came about, you see that people were never used to swiping. That wasn't the way that we would interact with devices in the same way that a mouse wasn't a thing that we used to use until very recently. So for people to learn how to use it, they create games around it. And so on the old Windows machine, and you still have that, you have Minesweeper and Solitaire, because people never had to click and drag and double click things before. And so those games would teach them how to playfully interact with the device. Angry Birds showed people how to use the swiping function on the smartphone because people had only known Nokia phones with buttons. And so every time we see a new technology come around, and that might be a physical device or later on like a metaverse, you end up having these different forms of play around it that fully integrate you into the technology and open up this whole new world. Yet somehow we insist that those things are separate. Somehow that's childish and separate, but it's actually integral to you doing your job, using the devices that you playfully got to know. So it's learned behavior, but I think it's in many ways it's something that is critical to day-to-day life.
I never realized that was Minesweeper's function, and it makes so much sense as you pointed out. The just clicking the very distinct points with gamifying that. So that's fascinating. We've got another question about esports here, and this one I have pulled up, and hopefully it won't scroll away from me. Joost, you mentioned the development of esports and how it will gain more popularity. What do you think? Will, for example, the international Dota 2's the international be at the same level of reputation as the Champions League? What should we expect from esports evolution in the next 5 years?
All right. So in the assumption that I'll be entirely incorrect about all of this, I think that people need both, right? And so the narrative that I ran into once we started. So I've been covering esports since like 2004. And then it was sort of like a whisper of a thing. Then it became more interesting. 10 years later, it became sort of a budding industry. And then, of course, it collapsed a little bit because, for all these external reasons. So esports keeps going through these ups and downs, but overall it goes up. The large part of the narrative that has been interesting to me is where it creates friction with conventional or traditional forms of sports. They've seen it as a threat. Right? You see a lot of both the fans and the league owners of any sport, really, they look at it with suspicion and say, esports, that's not a sport. Those are not athletes. They don't do anything. As a matter of fact, it's physically very straining, and it's a real discipline to do well. In the same way that athletes in any physical sport tend to be very young, and their career ends relatively quickly. It's the because you can't really, your reaction speed deteriorates over time. So that's kind of where we are today. You have the juxtaposition of esports versus every other sport out there. I think that's very naive. I think what we're going to start seeing is sort of a blend of the two, where conventional sports and video game-based sports, to situate them like that, are going to be existing alongside each other. And why not? Why couldn't there be these sort of parallel events and tournaments? Because I think in many ways, what defines us in society and what determines our status, right? Socially, it used to be if you were the big guy in your town, in your small village, you could just pummel everybody. So like they would always give you whatever the big piece of meat, and so over time that became like, okay, well who owns the most real estate in New York City? Oh, okay, that guy gets the biggest piece of meat. And so, but as the world becomes a little bit more abstract and we're capable of living our lives in digital environments, esports becomes a conduit to kind of determine that social hierarchy as well. And so for those reasons, I think that esports will continue to accelerate and find its own strength and momentum because it starts to mitigate where we sit. And you see it now. For instance, when we talk about competition between like South Korea and the US, there's rivalry there because one of them feels they're superior to the other. But are they? Let's find out in the next episode of blah, blah, blah. Right? So you start to see rivalry emerging, and like because really the subtext is like who's best at technology, like who's the most formidable competitor. And so I think esports will continue to accelerate, but it needs to find its own voice, right? It needs to not become some kind of, the kid sibling of like Big Brother Sports. It needs to approach the world in its own term and build its own revenue model and its own fan base and its own distribution channels. And I think it's still very much leaning on the concepts that we find in conventional sports to kind of get advertisers to care about it, but eventually it will split off and stand on its own 2 feet.
Mitch, maybe a point from my side. I mean, I see an interesting topic that is actually related to both questions, and that's, the reputation and the branding around gaming and esports. So from what Joost was saying, this, in the past, gaming being seen as geeks locked in their basement versus the pop culture gaming is becoming now, and a lot of things are happening in this area, right? So big brands invest and acquire esports teams. So that puts esports in a different position, and having esport games in the Olympics is another good example. Having in China on the main billboards in the main street, LeBron James with League of Legends pro players. So I mean, but I think it's important to remember that esport is a very young industry. And it's grown very fast. There's a lot of infrastructure work to align the fast growth. And you also mentioned a business model is one example of that. If you see multiples evaluations of esport teams, there is still a gap there. So I definitely see a very bright future for esport as a whole and for gaming as a whole. I think there's patience is needed here as these things change. And as marketers and brands get more excited about gaming as an advertising category or esport as an advertising category, and Twitch did an amazing job educating the esport side of things, and I think this will also help to the reputation of gaming and esport, and eventually it will take it to maximizing its potential. I don't think Dota 2 will be at the level of the football championship, but I do think that it can, be ranked very high in not only Dota, a lot of other games, and with this, core audience playing it and expanding. And I mean, today young adults want to be pro esport players. That wasn't a thing in the past. I think it's maybe the most exciting days in history to be a content creator with all the opportunities out there. And making a living from that. So it's happening. It's happening slower than maybe some people want it to happen. But yeah, and I think it's just changing so fast. And I think it's, as you said, it's hard to predict where this will end. But we see some trends and directions and have some good assumptions of that. So.
Absolutely, and I could talk about esports forever. I think we forget sometimes how long it took these sports leagues to reach the stature that they are today. We're like, oh, esports will be there in, the question had a 5-year time period. I don't think esports looks drastically different 5 years from now than it looks right now. There's probably more investment, maybe a few new games. Give it 20 years, give it 30 years, and then we're starting to see these leagues pop up to this crazy amount. But at the same time, League of Legends Worlds started 10 years ago, and now by AMA data has about 20 million viewers for the biggest event, and that's directly comparable to something like the NBA Finals or the NHL Finals. So they can accelerate very fast. There's also potential for things to drop off at the same time other things come up. Dota 2 viewership, one example of that with the international prize pool remains high. So my final question. We're running out of time, but I want to get one more question here. It's a question for Itamar. Question reads, I am not super familiar with Anzu, but I imagine you have to collaborate with diverse stakeholders across the game's landscape. Can you talk to some unique challenges to working with some of those stakeholders, e.g. content creators, publishers, companies interested in gaming, other players, etc.?
Sure. I mean, in one sentence, Anzu is the leading in-game advertising company. So we take branded content and put it inside video games in a very authentic and natural way. It's not a new concept. For 25 years, companies try to crack the code around in-game advertising, and a lot of very famous failures in that regard. We believe that now the stars are aligned around making this a big business, something that wasn't available in the past because of adoption of programmatic advertising and connectivity on the devices and changes in business models in video games and the adoption of standards game engines like Unreal and Unity, and the gaming industry becoming bigger, and this change of perceptions around of like marketers around gamers. So we believe the timing is right. And of course, yeah, there is multiple challenges. We deal with the platforms like a PlayStation and Xbox and Mac and Windows and AR and VR and iOS and Android. So there's lots of platforms. And then there's lots of engines, Unity and Unreal and custom engines in Lumberyard and CryEngine and you name it. And then you start to deal with the developers themselves, the game developers. And then you deal with the gamers, which the gamers' response to ads being authentic and natural is a big part of this. And then you are dealing with advertising companies and advertising standards and brands and media agencies. So yeah, it's a very crowded and competitive market. But like I'm in advertising for a long time. This is my second decade, and I could not be excited to be in a position to have a realistic chance of building one of the biggest advertising platforms, maybe the biggest platform to communicate with gamers globally, cross-platform. So yeah, I mean, a lot of challenges, but very exciting days and a lot of very good feedback from the market. So from having investors like WPP and Sony, and then to have big partners like Ubisoft, which is one of the bigger game developers, and big brands like American Eagle and PepsiCo. So keeps us busy, but no complaints.
It's a fascinating industry, and I think as gamers, we are happy to move away from a model that prioritizes $70 up front and then hoping the game's good, versus having free-to-play games with some branded activations in there, especially if the branded activations are done right, are not over-imposing, and support the world in general. And we're seeing a lot of major brands succeed on that front. Nike, Ford and Rocket League, MasterCard and League of Legends. These brands that are coming into the games, the gaming community is like, cool, sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah.
And Mitch, in the mobile space, there is intrusive ads and pop-ups and pop-ups and interstitials, and the advertising industry convinced mobile gamers that in order to get the game for free, it's fine to have intrusive ads. And this is something that we want to change. We believe that advertising should not be a trade-off with bad user experience, with negative, impact on retention. And I believe people don't hate ads, people hate bad ads. The rise of ad blockers is because of intrusive ad experiences. So I think there's a really strong opportunity in the market to do that better and do that right. And so yeah, I think it's one of the areas that we're looking at.
Absolutely. Well, I believe I missed a question or two in there, but I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question. Thank you all for joining, for asking, and to our panelists, Itamar and Joost, thank you for being on here. This was great.
Joost, it's always great to hear your smart things, and I'm looking forward to chat with you again.
I'll talk to you soon, Itamar. Thank you, Mitch.
Bye, everyone.